Hello, this is Dr. Rod Story with Mere Medicine here in the Fight Laugh Feast Cross Politic studio. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Cross Politic is a wonderful host, and we're glad to be supporting their mission as they seek to bring truth and faithfulness to the community at large and to provoke some good discussions. We, as a medical approach, want to kind of talk to our Christian brothers and sisters and inform them well on challenging topics in medicine, and also how to think about this in terms of our faithful Christian walk. So today we're going to be introducing a friend of mine. Let me introduce you to Johnny Peterson.
Hello there. How are you, Dr. Story?
Pleasure to have you on the phone and having you join us here by a little distance. You're up in Coeur d'Alene?
We are. We're still in Coeur d'Alene, Post Falls area, yeah.
So this is North Idaho, and we're located about 2 hours south, but I've had an opportunity to know Johnny throughout the years. I think it's going on about 13 years that we've been friends.
I think so, yeah.
How did you find your way to Moscow before we get any deeper into the weeds of medicine?
Oh, goodness. Well, that'd be over 20 years ago. Came to Moscow to go to New Sanders College and attended there for a couple of years, and then found a young lady and went and earned my bread so I could marry the young lady, and then finished New Sanders. So I attended there, started in 98, and I finished finally in 2006.
And then you went on to additional school from there. I
did. So at that point, I was working in a civil engineering field, and when the 2008-2009 recession came along, that kind of took away a lot of the work that was available, and so we ended up switching gears and did a couple of different things, and ended up going into nursing as I was looking for a field that I could provide for my family that was essentially recession-proof and to raise those kids.
And I think I got to know you before you went into the nursing career, because you helped me paint my house, which is kind of a fun way to spend some time together. And then as you and I talked about the medical career, I encouraged you to think about nursing. I hope I didn't push you into something that ultimately wasn't worthwhile. But I'm glad you worked really hard, and I loved watching you as a working dad, putting in the hours and studying hard for a career that you were attracted to. So today we're going to talk with Johnny Peterson and ask him some questions, because he is one of the brave many who went into nursing and the brave many who were also stepping out of nursing. So we're going to ask him some questions about that and get a bit of his story. But tell me, what were you looking to do when you went into nursing? Why were you attracted to it besides just being recession-proof?
Sure. There were actually quite a lot of reasons. I had a daughter who ended up being life-flighted for a respiratory issue. And the folks who took care of her, there was one gentleman in particular, a nurse, who just showed incredible professionalism and great care and knowledge and skill, and was instrumental in saving my daughter's life. And so he was a big inspiration. My dad is also a nurse and has been for many years, and also a big inspiration to me to go into that field. So those are probably the two primary things that drew me, just that chance to actually really be instrumental in someone's life, and to be that person who could have the skill to save someone's life and make their quality of life better. It was that was a very attractive thing.
And I think it's a fascinating thing to look at nursing. Nursing has become a very skilled field. You had to put in quite a few years in school to learn what you needed to do.
I did, yes. I got another bachelor's degree in nursing, and it was a strenuous 4 years of school. That's for sure. So between working and nursing, it was a good 100 hours a week that we put in to accomplish that. By the time we finished school, it was we were ready for just a job.
That is not a small investment of time or brain space. I have great respect for my nursing colleagues, and Johnny, you're always one of those that I particularly would think, man, if I end up in the hospital, that's the guy I want to take care of me. Talk to me about what your career has looked like. What have you ended up doing?
So I went directly from nursing school into a residency, a fellowship, where they trained me into the ICU. So I had a 6-month follow-up training period following school, working in the intensive care unit, and I worked there for about 2.5 years on nights. And that was it was a really neat opportunity. I learned a tremendous amount there. Just some very, very bright people that I was able to study under and to work with, and it was.
So when we're talking intensive care unit or ICU,
yes.
What kind of patients end up in the intensive care unit?
Oh, these would be open heart patients or people on ventilators, people who were not able to breathe on their own, people who needed serious life-saving measures, whether it was a diabetes, ketoacidosis sort of thing, and we had to deal with people's numbers that were way out of whack and try to bring them back to a safe, healthy level so they could survive and live. But these were people at death's door, and very frequently that was the case.
And in my experience as a hospital physician in a small town where we took care of those patients in the intensive care unit, your hospital was the one that we would send patients to who we were struggling with. So you guys
Correct.
were inheriting those challenging patients that had 4, 5, 6 medicines running and challenging life support issues. Where we wanted the best of the best taking care of them. So thank you for that level of care and that expertise that you put your time in on. Talk to me about how the COVID years have changed this. So obviously we're talking to you, and you are now working in a completely different career, and I'm going to ask you to tell us what that is, and then we'll come back full circle.
Sure. So I worked, as I mentioned, in the ICU for about 2.5 years. Following that, the next 5 years, I worked in the PACU. So we recovered patients from the operating room. We prepared them and recovered them from surgery. And so I wasn't in the ICU proper when the COVID, times were going on. I
like that term, COVID times. You seem to hesitate a little bit. We're trying to figure out what to call this thing looking backwards.
It's true. And so it was interesting because there were a number of things that I noted kind of going into it. And one of the big issues for me, and one of the things that I had a real problem with was the fact that when COVID hit, we had policy changes basically daily, where we would have a new mandatory instruction. You have to wear, a cloth mask is fine, and then 2 days later, N95 masks are required. And then we would go back to, well, we're short on N95 masks, so surgical masks are okay. And then we would go to, we're sharing PPE, so we're going to hang up an isolation gown outside of a patient's room, and every nurse.
So PPE, that's personal protective gear, is that correct?
Yes, sir. Yeah, so we would the respiratory therapist and the nurse and the physical therapist, anyone who had to go into this patient's room would wear the same gown, and it was a full body gown, and so it was really interesting because the two words that seemed to go together throughout that early COVID time were arbitrary and mandatory. And that was something that really, I think, lost a lot of people's faith and respect in the policymakers' decisions.
Well, especially when they change day to day, and it's not always related to actually the patient's care.
Correct.
But to something very different.
Correct. And so, and it was down to things like you need to leave an isolation room, because I was working in the operating room. And so we would have, the rooms that we'd recover patients in. And so we had several different bays that were designated, as negative pressure rooms, so that they're safe for isolation patients with COVID. And we would, the policies regarding those rooms would change nearly daily as well. So, at one point we had to wait 2 hours before we can clean a room, but then they realized that was backing up patients. And now we don't have enough recovery rooms because we're waiting all of this time with empty rooms. So then it changed to an hour, and then because it went from airborne precautions to droplet precautions. And so there are all these different levels of precautions and care that are taken to prevent, contamination and moving the illness to other people.
Well, here in our area, I happen to have privileges at 2 local hospitals. We straddle the Washington-Idaho border, and it was unique. Everybody was making it up as they went.
Yes.
And then you had the government weighing in Washington State. They were essentially shutting down the hospital and saying nothing that would be non-essential is the term that they used.
Right.
So they basically idled every surgery that had been scheduled for for knee replacements, for cataracts, for ear, nose, and throat procedures, for urology procedures, all these things that people have been waiting months for.
Yes.
And suddenly they were canceled, and those surgeons and physicians were basically told, I'm sorry, you're part of the problem, and we need you to stay out of the hospital.
Right. And
did you see that as well where you're at?
Absolutely. We experienced that a number of times where we were shut down for any elective procedures. And the definitions throughout that time of what an elective procedure was actually changed as well. So if you consider a knee replacement as an elective procedure, but then you consider that as time goes on, that you've got more bone on bone wearing, that you have more damage to the tissues around, and less mobility. So people who are have those bad knees, they can't walk, and so then they're gaining weight, they're becoming less mobile, and they'll have a lower quality of life if and when they survive to get that knee replacement. So then you add those surgeries, and they just back up, and so then you have multiple comorbidities that come along with that. You have people who are not getting screened for cancer. And I know of people who died from cancer and didn't get the screenings that they needed during that time.
Yes, the insanity of it all, and a lot of that became just as this, hey, there's fear out there. You have to fear this thing that you can't see. You're utterly responsible, ultimately responsible to not give this to anyone, and if you do, you're an evil person.
Right.
And it just created this whole culture of fear around particularly our hospitals. How did you see that impacting your work as a ICU nurse, and then ultimately as a PACU nurse?
What struck me as kind of interesting was that there seemed to be a generational divide in terms of the being susceptible to the fear mongering. So the people who had been around for a while, nurses who had been there for 20, 30 years, we've seen other pandemics, we've seen other flus and other things come through and go by, and so there was a healthy level of respect for a pathogen, but there was not quite the same mentality of panic and fear and desperation.
So not cavalier, not like, no. Hey, we'll give up washing our hands and we'll cough on everybody and we'll come to work sick.
But not also
foolishness.
Right. Yeah. Not foolishness, an appropriate level of care and responsibility, but also not being susceptible to the fear mongering that was going on. So a lot of the younger nurses, a lot of those who were kind of up and coming, were far more interested in all of the protocols and going through and making sure that everyone else was towing the line and being more. So it was interesting to note the generational divide.
That is interesting. We there's a lot of verbiage these days that's being tossed around. The word toxic workplace seems to be commonly labeled on places, but it sounds like that could have led to a toxic workplace.
Well, there certainly were those who were more of the talebearers, more concerned with appearing like, well, I'm not going to kill my grandma kind of mentality, and then some blame that would get passed around as a result. And again, when you're dealing with people's fears, people cherish their fears in a really fascinating way. There was one case. I took a patient over to the orthopedic unit in the hospital. They'd had some joint replacement, and the patient had just had COVID, I think 2 weeks before, 3 weeks before. So they were, they had some natural immunity because of having had that already. And so I expressed this to the nurse on the floor that I took the patient to, and he got really quite angry with me, and it's like, well, you don't know that. You don't know that they're safe. You don't know that anyone's safe. And the fact that I was trying to approach and mollify those fears to say that there was a reasonable level of hope for some immunity here, because I was kind of touching on his fears there and trying to diminish them. That was a really unfriendly thing to him, which was interesting to me.
Well, and that's a challenge when you're people who you normally would be looking to as colleagues and having a reasonable expectation of, hey, we're on the same team, we're playing with the same expectations, and suddenly you're feeling like you have to actually play this whole level of politics when you should be just giving patient care. Do you think that this fear that developed and the many different changes in how nurses were to approach the illness, do you think it affected quality of care in the hospital?
Well, absolutely. So it takes more time to deal with a patient when you have to go through multiple levels of isolation. So, right. So if you have to gown up and mask up, and you have to put the glasses on, you have to do all these things just to take someone a glass of water, for example. You're going to end up bundling your cares, because otherwise you're not going to physically be able to take care of the patients that you have. So even aside from the different levels of fear and concern, wanting to stay away from patients, and people not seeing anyone's face because of masks, blocking it, which I think is a really important thing. Even aside from all of that, just the nature of the time constraints and having to bundle cares so that you can get to all the patients that you have, you're going to go into this patient's room probably half as often as you otherwise would have. So,
that means what you're essentially saying is that there's half as many human connection points,
sure,
as there were before.
Right, and that's aside from any stigma related to I'm going to avoid this, patient with COVID. I don't want to get COVID. So, but aside from all the fears and the stigma, which that does change the personal relationships and the interactions for a lot of those people. I mean, if you're living in a life based on fear and trying to avoid danger, it does change your interactions with other people.
Yes.
Versus the life
we ran into stories, and these are shared directly firsthand from patients that I care for. A few patients, and we had actually several thousand that we cared for with COVID. Most who avoided being in the hospital because they were able to weather it at home. We ended up having 3 patients out of our several thousand member practice who were hospitalized. Each of them came back with a story where they were primarily cared for through windows.
Sure.
Where they were told, okay, here, I'm going to put this medicine under the door and I want you to take it, where they were essentially without any human contact for most of the 24-hour days that they were in the hospital. This impacted their care dramatically. Not only was it, I mean, they were treated like bags of chemicals, right. Physical beings or machines behind doors, but not in a human compassion. I'm going to touch you. I'm going to sit with you. I'm going to visit with you. I'm going to treat you as someone who needs more than just meds pushed in and pee measured as it comes out. Right.
Yeah, and that is, I think, really detrimental. My grandmother died during COVID, and
okay.
she was becoming somewhat demented. She was in a nursing home, a long-term care facility, and she was not allowed to have any family visits, any pastoral visits. No one was allowed to come see her for about a year. And so she became increasingly demented, older
for a whole year.
For a whole year.
Did I just hear you correctly?
For a
whole year,
yes,
no
sir.
family contact.
Correct. And so when you're becoming demented as an older person going through some of those trials, your tie to reality is people, especially your people. So your family, she couldn't remember anything from recent memory, but she knew her family. She had those faces, just because that was pounded into her for her whole life, that these were her people, and to take that away from someone, she became increasingly out of touch with reality and paranoid, and ended up falling because of this paranoia, and broke her hip, and from there it was not a terribly long time before she passed.
Okay.
And so I think
we were ultimately protecting her from COVID,
right, to the detriment of her life.
The detriment of so many other things.
And I think, and that's not an isolated case. I think that's been a very common thing. I did home the last 6 months that I was in nursing. I'd left the hospital this last March, and I did home health nursing for about 6 months after that. And it was a really neat experience in a lot of ways, because I was able to go into people's homes and be a point of human contact with them, to pray with them, or to take care of them and talk with them while I'm doing the basic necessities that they need to have done,
sure.
Dressing changes and all of that. And so, but for a lot of these people, I'd say the average age of that population was about 80 years old. And, a lot of them had recently lost a spouse on several occasions. And to be there and be that person to listen to them for a half an hour or 45 minutes, and to be able to take the time to, care for them and to show them some human kindness, as well as providing for the physical necessity. It was a really important job, I think. And it was something that, whether it was a long-term care facility, a lot of the folks in the long-term care facilities were, if there was an outbreak of COVID in the facility, they would be isolated to their rooms. They would not have any common, time out in the meal room or anywhere else. They would be isolated in their rooms, and that happened for months at a time. So there was one
Wow.
gentleman who was isolated in his room for 6 months, and he was not allowed to come out of his room for 6 months that I helped. And so he would have someone come in, to clean or to bring him food a few times a day. And that was his experience of people for 6 months. And I think there's a huge.
Well, and clearly, I mean, as a nurse, you're just a very small connection point for familiarity, for comfort, for kindness.
Yeah.
And in so many of these circumstances, the families were either kept away or purposely stayed away for fear that they might, like you said, kill grandpa.
Right.
And yet something essentially human was missing. Something essential to nursing as well. Do you think this played a role? I mean, clearly, you're no longer practicing nursing. You're in a completely different career, and some of that I know is, as you and I've shared the story, is about your family and caring well for them. Tell me that story about leaving nursing.
So yeah, this last year, I became increasingly just convinced that things were moving in a direction that I didn't want to go. Nursing care and healthcare in general, I think, is a little bit inclined towards a socialistic mentality to begin with. So people can't be responsible to take care of themselves. They eat too much, they drink too much, they smoke too much, and so people should be made to do what is good for them. And there's something of that mentality that I think is increasing with, again, this younger generation, that there is this increased mentality of we need to control people, whether we make laws or whether we make rules, whatever this happens, whether we shame people for different life habits, that we need to control them. And so there was that mentality, and that kind of leaked into the whole mentality also of what kind of protective equipment you're wearing, and how you're responsible to take care of all these people. But then there's a kind of a divide with that as well, where there are the people who are going through, and like whichever mandatory arbitrary rule is made today, that is the new set in stone 11th commandment, right? So
sure,
this is
science settled, even though was settled last week and it changed.
Right.
There's been this really moving target of dictates that have come through.
And so for me, it was this kind of constantly changing arbitrary mandatory combination of rules that I didn't see that going away. And I kind of just anticipated that there would be a COVID vaccine mandate for anyone in healthcare coming down the pike as well. And I was not inclined towards that. I did get a pretty rousing case of COVID myself.
Welcome to the club.
Yes.
It's the data shows that gives long-lasting beneficial immunity that carries over to all of the variants much better than the vaccine did. And if you're like me, I mean, I imagine you probably got it in the course of caring for people.
I did, yeah. Got it while I was at the hospital.
I happen to be fighting sniffles right now, and probably it's better that you're not in the studio with me. But as we care for people, we put ourselves at risk. We can't help but pick up the things, kind of like elementary school teachers. They bring it all home.
For sure.
So you made a decision to do something different. What was the final straw? Was there a moment where you and your wife were like, this is just broken, or was there an opportunity that came along?
It was kind of it was an accumulation of things. It wasn't any one particular event that I broke ties with. I left on good terms, and everyone said they were sorry to see me go. Whether or not they actually were, they were at least very polite about it. But it was a good situation. I was able to leave, and it was a good unit that I was in. I was very thankful for a lot of my coworkers, And so I would not be opposed to getting back into healthcare at some point if it was more along the lines of what you're doing in a more, you know,
Well, yeah, the Independence clinic has been a really remarkable place to be in medicine, especially during this crazy pandemic, where things have been dictated from on high, and there's not been opportunity to speak or even ask questions about why are we doing what we're doing.
Right, and there's I'm sorry.
Go ahead, sir.
There's another clinic like that that's just opened up here recently, and they're looking to start another one up in Sandpoint. And so I think we're going to see more and more call for that kind of care, and I think that's a really good thing.
It really is. I think people are realizing that the healthcare industry is really consolidated since the Affordable Care Act, or what we call Obamacare, and it has not been a good thing. Locally, we had a group of physicians who were in charge of the local hospitals and their response to COVID and the choices that were made and put in place for the so-called protection of everyone, and those still remain in place. Like the last people still wearing masks and treating it like nothing has changed are the hospital circumstances. But what's fascinating is everybody on that board is also employed by the hospital. And so there's no freedom to speak differently or outside, especially when the hospital is saying, we're going to cut your opportunities for surgery unless you fall in line.
Sure.
And so, I mean, you're beholden, and we're thankful now to be an independent clinic and have 4 physicians that are working in our location, and I see that growing like crazy around the United States. It saddens me when I look at my nursing colleagues, and I've read a couple of articles. Like I have one here that I'm looking at that says that 90% of nurses are considering leaving the profession in this next year. And this was published in March 24th of 2022. This was an industry survey. Yeah. I'm looking at another one that talks about that new nurses are leaving. That other article was saying that even nurses that have been around for 15 years, they have a huge investment. They're really looking to leave. Fox News had an article just this year talking about how it's not just nurses, but it's physicians, and there's this great resignation that seems to be even more likely in the medical world. Man, sure. What a shortage that's going to be. Did you hear much of that conversation when you were in the healthcare industry?
I did. As I was kind of contemplating leaving in particular, we've been through this pandemic thing for about a year and a half at that time. And people were just people were over it. A lot of my coworkers, a number of them have left. The hospital has kind of been hemorrhaging nursing staff in particular, and a lot of others that I've spoken with have indicated that they feel trapped. They don't have a marketable skill that they can go do something else, but they would love to be done with nursing, which is really a tragic thing because it's a noble profession. It's something that I think is really important. People desperately need good quality nursing care along with good physicians. So to see that happening and that be a pretty widespread thing, it's rough.
It is very frightening, especially as we have the boomers, the baby boomer generation coming through and needing care. I drive down a street in my town, and every time I drive by this house, they have a sign out front that says caregiver needed, and it has their own personal phone number. It's been up for months. Yeah. And that tells me that there are people that are desperate for in-home care, desperate to have someone who will extend the skills and talents of nursing and be able to just provide the things that people are needing, and yet no answer. That sign's still out there. I suspect it's just one of many that are out there as well. Well, I think honestly, we tend to see these in such a negative way, and perhaps it's having grown up watching Left Behind or reading some of those books. But I think there is a remarkable opportunity as believers, as followers of Christ, in these moments where culture is hitting the fan. And I would love for you to kind of give me some thoughts on what would it take for Christians to turn this around. What would it take for us to create a true alternative? What would that look like?
Well, I think it's looking like some of the things that we're seeing come up. There's talk of a surgery center being built up here. There is this direct primary care, and the office we have up here is a Christian run direct primary care as well, and
Oh, that's cool.
seeing people who are willing to, who just have a heart to care for people and want to provide services that are desperately needed, but are
Mm.
able to move away from the more of the institutional healthcare. And I think part of it is a boldness and a willingness to do that, which is a
Mm.
scary thing for a lot of people. Especially you get out of medical school, you get out of nursing school, and you have, debts, you've got a family to provide for, you have things that are kind of probably weighing heavy. And then the unknown is always a frightening thing for a lot of people. So just being willing to take that step to move, to organize and move into a sustainable private care practice, I think we're gonna have to see a lot more of that.
Well, and we're seeing people who are leaving, these West Coast states that are so heavy with not only red tape but with mandates, moving to places like Idaho, which are really pride themselves on letting professionals do their job and leaving them to do that well. I'm thankful as a believer to be able to really practice very independently, and we're seeing, like I said, we've had 3 other physicians come join me in the last 4 years that
That's
we've been
wonderful.
open. And we see no end in growth. One of the things that we've seen is people looking for alternatives, and that seems to be one of the drivers of opportunity, but also really truly Christ-honoring medical care that isn't tied to the ugly things that government is forcing, abortion, euthanasia, transgenderism. There's a crazy number of things that are waiting that the Biden administration would like to push through. We, because we don't contract with government healthcare,
Right.
are free from those mandates. And I would encourage our Christian brothers and sisters that are listening to consider how entering the marketplace and doing something like a health share ministry. I don't know if your family is on one.
Mm-hmm.
Which one do you guys use?
We use Samaritan Ministries.
Yeah, as do we. And we have quite a few people that use MediShare and Christian Health Share, and there's a number of them, and they're well established,
Yes.
and they really are quite stepped out. Have you used it for your family's care?
I don't think we actually have, but
Ah.
we're thankful to have that safety net.
Well, and for and cost wise, it seems to be a great place for getting that coverage that might eventually be needed. My wife had appendix out. It cost $30,000 in our little tiny hospital in 12 hours. It was crazy.
Wow. Yeah.
My son broke his arm and had to have it set under anesthesia, and both times the health share really helped us cover those big expenses.
Yeah, that's
that would have
wonderful.
been hard to save for. And what we're seeing is not just these direct primary cares or these health shares or these independent cash pay surgery options or imaging options really popping up everywhere, but a willingness for believers to step out of the system and say, I need to look for a real alternative that helps me look for something that would be care that I would be glad to support and partner with.
Absolutely.
Well, talk to me about business. It sounds like you're growing and doing well.
We're very thankful. I started a painting business again last year, and I just started working with my kids. So I really like my coworkers, which is a lot of fun. And my older kids
They
are
still
with
like
me.
you?
We have a wonderful time together.
Isn't that great?
It's a huge blessing. Very, very thankful. So I've just enjoyed my time working with my kids. I had this kind of special time where they're, a couple of them are in high school. One of them's at U of I for engineering, and he's back for the summer. So we're all working together, and it's just it's a wonderful thing.
Isn't family-run business a pretty amazing gift? And
Yeah.
we run one as well through Story Family Medicine, where my wife is our office manager part-time, and my daughter is my main medical assistant, and everyone else in our office are either fellow believers and even church mates in many cases.
Yeah.
It's a marvelous thing to start a business, and I would encourage anyone who's right on the edge to go ahead and do that with us. Well, Johnny, do you mind if I finish by praying for us?
That'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Father, I thank you for Johnny Peterson. I thank you for his career as a nurse. I thank you also for the opportunity now to have a painting business and to bless his family and to do it even with them. Father, it's a challenging time to walk as a believer, but Father, you use those times to burn off what should be gone, to shake us, and to leave what remains. Father, we want what remains to be to your glory. We just ask that you'd help us to walk faithfully through the Holy Spirit, and in the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen.
Thank you, friend.
Very good. Thank you, sir.
Very good. Here on Mere Medical, we'll be interviewing a couple more nurses over the next few weeks, but also on talking about medical education and wokeism and how it's just made a mess of medical education. Thanks so much for joining us here today.